As you may or may not know, one of the things I have a soft spot for is magnets and motors. Now, when I was a little kid, I would pull stuff out of the garbage that had a toy that had a motor in it. I always take the motor out, play with the motor for a while, then take the motor apart and keep the magnet and throw the motor away. And I'd also inspect the armature. Some motors were better than others. Like this motor here, I think this is from an RC car. I bought this at a hobby shop, and I was trying to make I actually made a third axis unit with the not a Dremel. Well, it ended up having a Dremel tool, but in other words, you want to have a milling head on the CNC machine. So it'd be a motor and a pulley and some type of chuck. And in the end, I ended up using a Dremel tool that had been shimmed and worked on a little bit. But so I had a thing for motors. But it's funny things. You go to tech school, and you work the first few days. You have a board with some Ferrin stock clips and some resistors, and the teacher's explaining how many in parallel and figure out the resistance, and then measure it with the ohm meter and see if it's correct. Put some in series, and the guys are doing that, and about 50% of the class is bitching. This is too simple. This is stupid. And this is the basics. Understanding a parallel circuit, a series circuit, an open and a short. Now I can guarantee you 50% of those people in that class did not understand the difference between a short circuit and an open. The circuit wouldn't work, and you'd hear them say, I must have a short. Well, usually when you have a short, the fuse blows, or you get smoke, or something overheats. An open is just a connection that's broken, or a part that's opened up. Okay? So anyway, you got them bitching and moaning how simple everything is. And I know what's coming, because I had the RETS electronic course in high school. And it starts off real simple. And then before you know it, everybody's lost. I mean lost, including the instructor in high school. And I took it upon myself to get the radios working in the class. That guy hated me. My sister said he was a cut-up. I didn't understand that cut-up was a person that just belittled you. I thought he was a funny guy. He cracked a lot of jokes, but a lot of them were personal attacks on different kids. Well, anyway, so in high school, I helped everybody get their radio working. And after that, the classes before ours and classes after ours in years, nobody got the radios working. So now I had the RETS course in high school. I go to RETS, and I know I'm sitting there waiting for it to get harder. And what was different at RETS, the school, and RETS course in high school, was they brought out this can and it had a REMCO motor in it. Look up REMCO motor. REMCO actually means remote control. That's where they derived the name for the company. It was down, I believe, in Harrison or Newark. I had relatives that worked there, and that's where I would get some of the REMCO toys. Well, anyway, they give you this can, and it's like the big protein mix cans. It's got a metal top, a metal bottom, a cardboard sides, or a cardboard tube, and you open it up, and out comes all the pieces to make the REMCO the REMCO motor. So I'm sitting there and I'm looking at them like I had one of these, okay? And I went over to, I can tell you where I went. I went to Woolworths in Belleville, and I went in looking for the Rocket. The Rocket worked on baking soda and vinegar. They didn't have it. I had the money. I bought the motor, and I came home. I opened the tube up, and I realized I had taken a lot of motors apart, but I was chicken shit. Okay, I looked at the pieces, and I waited for my father to come home. And then after dinner, we went step by step. We read the directions, and we put the motor together, and it worked. And the motor doesn't use a magnet; it uses a field coil that you have to wind also. And when you go through the instructions, they tell you wind all. Let's see, each field coil on the armature. There was 3 field coils, and they all had to be wound in the same direction. you have to wind the wires neatly so they all fit on each armature or each arm of the armature. And you got to be neat. You got to wind them in the right direction. You got to put the right amount of turns. And then you cut the wire and you clean the ends. It's enamel wire. You clean the ends with either a piece of sandpaper or razor blade. Some guys in RETS, they had lighters. They were setting them on fire. And it seems like a simple little toy. All right, so I'm sitting there and I'm into winding the windings real neat because I had built one of these before when I was little, and now I'm older. And I'm like, you know what, I'm going to really do this one really good. And what was bothering me was the flashing on the plastic parts, and it wasn't that great. Over the years, I guess their dies had gotten a little worn out. But anyway, you put it all together, and the teacher comes over to you and he asks you, are you ready? And you say, yeah. Now you put the voltage across it, and it spins, and he writes you up. That's it. It's a pass. Okay? And then he tells you something like, you know, it also run on AC. And you're like, in your mind, it's a DC motor. But because there's no magnet in it, it has a field coil. It synchronizes, or out of phase, whatever, blah, 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 the motor will work. And he says to me, now go get an AC transformer and hook it up. And it spun. And then he gives you another pass. Now, the rest of the room, I had my two friends, Bill and Tom. Theirs worked. You know who's not radio. I keep saying radio because REMCO is a radio. Whose motor is going to spin? And this one kid, I mentioned him a few times. He's a little freaking baby, and right away it's the motor's fault. He wound all the coils. You can only wind one coil the wrong direction because there's 3 coils. So if you wind 2 one way and 1 one way, so 1 out of 3 is backwards. So you can see the motors jumping back and forth, and he doesn't get a pass. Now he's all upset. It's the cheap freaking REMCO's fault. He didn't read the instructions. And you look over, and the wire's all balled up. He didn't, in the little diagram, it tells you. They tell you, and it's so funny. And then the teacher's explaining him how to troubleshoot it, and he's like a little 10-year-old, nah, like that. And I'm like, I was hoping that guy would quit. He never did. He went right to the end with us being the same way. But to see those other guys that were like, this is too simple, now they're actually sweating bullets. You look down at them, they're like, the guy comes up to them, puts the voltage on, and nothing. I mean, dead. And they spin it, nothing. Also, I should mention you have an armature, and you also have a commutator, or is it a commutator? So I did synchros. I get all messed up. Well, anyway, the commutator has 2 brushes on it, and it provides the voltage for each coil on the motor at the right phase as to the field coil, so it'll spin. Well, if you get that out of phase, you could have all three coils wound correctly. All right, but if you don't have that commutator, the way the book tells you, or the little pamphlet tells you, it's not going to work. So another guy fails. So you got a whole row of guys that have the windings wound nice and neat, but they didn't read the part where the commutator, I think it's sat in the middle. Well, anyway, they show you real quick in a picture, and they tell you like this, and none of the guys read the thing. They just were looking to the guy next to them. I always like those guys, blind leading the blind. The one guy watching the other guy because he's not sure what to do, and instead of asking, he copies the guy next to him. So the guy next to him, it doesn't work, and neither does his. And it was a funny thing. And within that week, you started seeing guys drop out, because then we went on to using transformers and voltages, and maybe a couple tubes, and you had to take some readings, and they were clueless. They were totally clueless. Now, in RETS, you'd go in a room in the morning, and the guy's name was Mr. Powell, and he'd go through the mathematics and the diagram of what you were going to do in the lab. And these kids would be sitting there playing goosey man, and sleeping. And then we'd go into the lab, and they would fail in the lab. They wouldn't, whatever they were working on, they were lost, and they would start to disappear. And I told you when the deferment got taken away, a bunch more kids disappeared. Now, what happened with RETS was when I first went there, or before I went there, they would actually give you a test, and you might not get into school. And then it became like a paper mill. Right around the time I went there, right around the 70s. In other words, they would bring kids in to get that $800 down. And you couldn't get that back. So as soon as the day you walked in the door and sat at the desk, that $800 was theirs. So they made a lot of money on kids that got into school that had no clue what they were doing. You know, but look up the REMCO motor, and you know it's got little spacers and stuff. You put the laminations of the armature together, and when you look at it, the first sets of kits, the first one I got, all the parts were very distinctly made out of plastic and steel. And then when I got the one in RETS, it was the flashing on the plastic. It wasn't made as well, but it did work. Okay, and they just gave you that thing, and they went over the right-hand rule, left-hand rule of magnetism. So in other words, when you wound the coil in one direction, the winding on the armature, it would make it a north and south pole depending on what the polarity of the battery was, and you had to have all three of those wound in the same direction. And then now you got 2 leads per coil coming off, and they go down into the commutator, and it all has to be right, or the motor won't work. And I still think about this to this day. That's the people I had to work with. They came out of the schools, didn't know what they were doing, and they would double down when they were wrong. And you had to sit there and listen to the boss argue with them. Then the boss would put me on the job. It would get fixed, and then they would hate me. Okay, but you saw a taste of what was coming in life in tech school. High school was a little bit different. You could have kids sit vegetatively in a classroom, and then they'd hand out the test, and everybody would take a test, and you really didn't know what the kid next to you was getting. Where in tech school, it was hands-on, and you could look at them, and you know, it was just fun to watch. Some of the kids, they just decided, out of high school, they just decided, oh, I'll go learn electronics. Where in my case, I knew long before that. I was into it. And a lot of this stuff, the first week of RETS, I already knew. But I knew what was coming. You know, I knew I had seen some of the manuals and stuff. I read ahead on them. I'm like, oh, boy. And you have to learn stuff that you really don't want to learn. And one of the worst things was you have a transmitter, and you have an antenna a certain distance away, and it's like a 100,000 watt or 50,000 watt transmitter, and you have to figure out the distance of the wire from the transmitter to the antenna in wavelengths, and it's called a Smith chart. And we went over that with our instructor, and there's nobody in that room that could do a Smith chart, and that includes me. The other one was they show you the curve. In the transistor manual, the RCA transistor manual, there's these curves and charts, and you plot out what voltage you're going to use and what bias, and then you see where the gain lies and is your bias right and all this stuff. See, when you repair, you basically take out a bad part, put in another part. But in engineering, you have to actually figure out the bias. Now later on, transistors became a lot easier figuring out the bias. There were some set values that worked, but there were things in there where the instructor is going over it, and he's hoping that nobody asks a question, okay? And one of them is the Smith chart, and the other one is the biasing for transistors. And we also did biasing of tubes. And I always carried a tube manual around, an RCA tube manual, even though we were past tubes. And the teacher always promised to give me a new one because he wore my tube manual out, because I carried it with me, and whenever we're in there, later on in RETS, you're into repairing stuff in the lab instead of doing tests. And a lot of stuff the kids were bringing in had tubes, and they would use my tube manual, and it fell apart. But when I worked in RCA, I got a new tube manual, new transistor manual. I got the whole set of all that stuff. But it's so funny when you're in there with a group of people, and the first couple of days in electronics is real simple. And they're sleeping in the class. And you're looking over and the guy's totally asleep. And you go out on a break and goes, boy, this is so easy and so boring. And I'm like, really? Okay. And then little by little you get your first, the first semester test. and I'm going through it, and in one case they had 6 volts DC going into a transformer, and they had the ratio of the transformer and the output, and I'm looking, I'm like, DC doesn't go through a transformer. And every kid in the class I mentioned that to, they're like, no, you just take the, I said, no, DC will not go through a transformer. And they didn't catch that. And I was like, holy crap, you know. Now, if you put a battery, like a 9-volt battery across the transformer, and you draw enough current, the 9-volt battery will start arcing inside, internally, and that pulsing will go through the transformer, come out the other side, okay? But DC doesn't go through a transformer. And it was funny, everybody got that, except me, got that question wrong. And, you know, I paid attention to a lot of stuff. And like I said, I pulled a lot of things out of the garbage when I was little, and I'd run experiments on stuff. And my library only had 3 electronic books, and I constantly take them out and bring them home and go through it page by page by page. And then I had my dad had an issue of Popular Electronics he got when he had the TV repair shop. So I had a whole set, 2 or 3 years of Popular Electronics. And I'd constantly go through those. Every day I'd have one in my room and sit there and go over it and over and over. Because there's so much in electronics that you really need to know. And don't forget, back then you couldn't go to the internet and look something up. So if you didn't have it in your head, or you didn't have a reference book near you, or someone else, you were screwed, okay? And that's why in RCA, I knew what engineer to go to, who had the reference book. And they wouldn't let you take the reference book away from their area, but you could still go there and look at their reference books and figure out what the hell was going on. And most of the stuff I did was for home projects, okay? And like I said, RCA gave me full sets of books when I became an employee. Anything that was RCA publication, you could request it and they bring it right over to you. So I had a pretty good setup going in life. What was the problem was the people that got into the job and they never learned anything new, and they thought going to tech school was enough. And you see that some of the plumbers that worked on building houses, they would learn a certain amount of things, and then they didn't want to learn anymore. And as new products come along, you can see they would struggle. And yeah, I've seen a lot, you know. But the fun thing is when you got a group of guys out of high school, and none of them know really what they want to do. They all jump into like a tech school. And then they, like I said, a lot of them were sleeping in the back. They'd sit in the back and they, you know, they'd go out drinking the night before and they'd be shot the next day. And us other types, we'd be sitting up towards the front of the class. And then it was like attrition. Is it attrition? Where people start disappearing? Well, the back of the class, those kids start to disappear. And like I told you, like 15 of us finished. And there were 2 sections. There had to be, I believe, 120 kids went in to learn in RETS, and only 15 finished. I believe it was 120. We had 2 sections that I would, you know, in my group. And yeah, it was something else. And some of the instructors, they were just up there babbling, you know, babbling. They did it so many times. And you'd ask them a question. A lot of times, they didn't even catch where the hell they were. They were just going through the motions. And then, like I told you in the beginning, we had like 8 different instructors. We had Whalen originally. Gentlemen, gentlemen. That's how he used to talk. Sort of like Elmer Fudd and W.C. Fields. But Whalen was a memorized spoon feeder. Okay? He would come in and he'd tell you these fantastic stories. And then he'd shoot back out because he was becoming director of the school. So we had him as an instructor. So a girl would come to the door, and you're needed up, Mike, you're needed at the front. So he'd leave us, and some of the kids would start beating on each other, you know. There was a pretty good fight one time, and the one kid flipped it. We were sitting on these benches, and we were watching a movie, and the one kid took the kid and grabbed him by the head, threw him backwards, and his head hit the floor like a pineapple or a melon. And that kid got up, and he started swinging, and this little tiny kid, I didn't know he was a bouncer at a bar. He went over there and he grabbed both of those 2 big kids and separated them and basically made them shake hands, and then he came over and sat down. He scared the crap out of them, and I know his last name, but anyway, he didn't finish either. He got into selling pots and pans to newlyweds. He says it would make more money. At that time, he says in electronics, what you would make when you graduated, and he could make more money just working at night part-time, selling pots and pans to people that just got, to girls that just got married. Oh, it was hilarious. But the REMCO radio, look it up, and it's a toy, and there's a whole series of toys. There's one that's got magnets. I remember the kid Teichman in high school. He had the one with the magnets. I had the motor. My cousin Roger, he had the rocket ship, and we went there to visit one time, and his father come out, and we set it off in the street, and you put in the vinegar and baking soda, and the thing went really pretty high up in the air. And his father did it like real serious, like the son wasn't allowed to use the rocket unless he was with him. It's pretty funny stuff. It wasn't an Estes rocket. It was a rocket that used vinegar and baking soda. But it was funny. I saw that. I wanted one. I went right over to my stores, and all they had were the kits that nobody wanted, and I ended up with the REMCO motor. But you know, like I said, me and my father, we put that motor together, and then when I was counting the turns, I was getting a little confused. And then he got a piece of paper, and he says, count to 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. With your windings. And I put an X on the paper, and then do another 10. Put an X, and that way I could do 100 turns, whatever it was, without screwing up. Because I do have ADD and dyslexia. I've suffered through this thing my whole life, but I do have hyper attention. No, not hyper. I'm gonna forget that word. In other words, having ADD, you can have a attention that's super hyper. You really can focus on something that other people can't do. And I can do that when I'm excited about something. And I can focus and get the job done. I think that's it. All right, that's it.